This piece of parchment is probably the most important document in New Zealand history. It's Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our founding document.
And the reason it looks a bit worse for wear is because it's been neglected, physically and politically. The treaty documents spent decades buried in a pile of old papers and rubbish under the old government buildings in Wellington. They were damaged by water and gnawed by rats. At one point they were nearly lost in a fire.
The treaty captures a spirit of partnership and equality which is very rare in the colonial era, but its exact wording helps set up a legacy of conflict between Māori and Pakeha. I'm Lee Marama McLaughlin.
And I'm William Ray.
Welcome to the Aotearoa History Show.
Okay, quick recap. We're in the late 1830s. Thanks to a combination of war and introduced disease, the Māori population has dropped from about 100,000 to around 70 or 80,000.
But Māori still dominate New Zealand. The only major European settlement is at Kororareka, also known as Russell. It's home to about 200 Pakeha, a ragtag bunch of traders, missionaries, mutineers and escaped convicts.
For a while, Kororareka was the biggest whaling port in the southern hemisphere, and it was a party town, a place where sailors could blow off steam after months at sea. Prostitution and alcohol were big business. The missionaries were very upset by all this immoral behaviour. One described Kororareka as the scourge of the Pacific, which should be struck down by the ravages of disease for its depravity.
Rangatira weren't super happy with what was going on in Kororareka either. They complained that European traders abused them and refused to pay fairly.
There were also accounts of underage prostitution involving sailors and Māori girls.
So in 1833, missionaries and rangatira got together and asked the British Crown to send somebody to sort this all out.
That somebody was James Busby. He had the grand title of official British resident, but not much actual power. He couldn't raise troops or command warships, so he had a tough time doing anything. Māori used to make fun of him by calling him a man of war without guns.
But eventually rangatira, Busby and the missionaries came up with a plan. First they set up something called the United Tribes of New Zealand, which was a group of Ngāpuhi rangatira like Tāmati Wakanene, Rewa and Patuone, plus a couple of significant chiefs from further south like the Waikato rangatira Potato Te Wero. They picked a flag and declared independence.
The United Tribes was partly an effort to keep British subjects in New Zealand under control, but it was also part of a wider power struggle in the Pacific.
Okay, so there was this crazy wannabe French aristocrat called Baron Charles Philippe Hippolyte de Thierry. He rocked up to the Bay of Islands, declared himself King of New Zealand, and tried to set up a French colony in Hokianga.
There was also another slightly more serious French colony planned down south in Aotearoa. Britain's move to officially recognise the independence of the United Tribes created a roadblock for French colonisation, but it wasn't a very big roadblock.
The British could only see one way to completely stop the French annexing Aotearoa: annex it themselves first. But they weren't all on the same page.
A lot of people in the British government thought colonising New Zealand might be more trouble than it was worth. By 1840, the British Empire was already at war in Afghanistan and China and facing rising tensions in India and Crimea. But there were some British subjects who definitely did want a slice of New Zealand, including a guy called Edward Gibbon Wakefield.
The story of Wakefield's involvement in New Zealand starts in prison, which might tell you something. In 1826, a 30-year-old Wakefield was sentenced to 3 years in jail after he abducted a 15-year-old schoolgirl with plans to marry her and get hold of her family fortune. But while he was locked up, Wakefield came up with an elaborate scheme for a new kind of colony, which he thought would help ease social tensions in England, boost the British economy, and make Wakefield himself super rich and famous.
You know, just the normal kind of thing you think about when you're in jail.
Wakefield thought New Zealand was the perfect place to test out his new colonial system. After he got out of prison, he and his brothers got together with some financiers and set up the New Zealand Company.
The success of this company hinged on a plan to buy land cheaply from Māori, sell it to rich colonists at a much higher price, then reinvest the profits in subsidising tickets for poor British workers to sail to New Zealand and become the labouring class.
Wakefield sold his colony as a utopia where poor British workers could escape the crime and poverty of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. He described Wellington region as open, undulating plains, perfect for growing grapes, olives and wheat. Not exactly an accurate description.
But there was another faction in Britain who had some serious concerns with this plan. The missionaries in Aotearoa thought Wakefield's colonisation scheme would inevitably lead to the, quote, conquest and extermination of Māori. They were backed up by a group called the Aborigines Protection Society, which had been founded a few years earlier to protect the rights of indigenous people all over the world.
The authorities in London felt caught between two choices. Either they allow uncontrolled colonisation by the likes of Wakefield and the French, or take control of New Zealand and impose what they thought would be a more orderly kind of colonisation. They went with the second option.
In January 1840, a British naval officer called William Hobson arrived in the Bay of Islands with orders to sign a treaty with Māori, transferring their sovereignty to the British Crown. And partly thanks to the efforts of the Aborigines Protection Society, Hobson had very strict instructions about how to negotiate this treaty. They, meaning Māori, must not be permitted to enter into any contracts in which they might be ignorant and unintentional authors of injuries to themselves. So basically, Māori had to sign over their sovereignty willingly. They couldn't be forced or tricked.
Seems like a good start, but here's where things start to go wrong. Hobson had not actually written this treaty by the time he got to New Zealand. So the document was cobbled together in a few days by Hobson, James Busby and some of the missionaries. Then it had to be translated into Te Reo Māori so the chiefs could understand it. This translation was done by the missionary Henry Williams and his son Edward in a single night. In fact, the signing of Te Tiriti was so rushed, Hobson didn't even have time to get dressed into his fancy naval uniform before he went to the signing ceremony.
About 500 Māori arrived at Waitangi, and after the chiefs had heard the Māori version of the treaty read aloud, 14 of them got up to give speeches about what they'd just heard.
One of the most pointed speeches came from a ngaitawa ki rangatira called Wai. Will you remedy the selling, the exchanging, the cheating, the lying, the stealing of the whites? Oh, Governor, yesterday I was cursed by a white man. Is that straight? The white gives us natives £1 for a pig, but he gives a white £4 for such a pig. Is that straight? No, no. They will not listen to you, so go back.
Another ngaitawa ki rangatira called Rewa had even more dire concerns. Do not sign the paper. If you do, you will be reduced to the condition of slaves and be compelled to break stones on the road. Your land will be taken from you, and your dignity as chief will be destroyed.
But some chiefs spoke in favour of the governor, one of the most famous being Hone Heke. Some of you tell Hobson to go, but that's not going to solve our difficulties. We've already sold so much land here in the north. We have no way of controlling the Europeans who have settled on it. I'm amazed to hear you telling him to go.
Eventually, more than 40 rangatira agreed to sign the treaty, including some of those who spoke against it. Hobson shook each of their hands and said, "He iwi tahi tātou." We're now one people.
Later, several copies of the treaty went on tours all over Aotearoa. They were signed by about 500 Māori leaders. 13 of those signatures came from Wahine. All but one of the documents they signed were Māori language versions, which is important. We'll explain why in just a second.
Hobson sent a letter back to the UK saying the North Island had been ceded to Britain with, quote, unanimous adherence.
But that wasn't true. Several North Island rangatira refused to sign the treaty, including leaders of Ngāi Tūhoi, Te Arawa, Ngāti Tūwaretua and Waikato. Some weren't even asked.
Hobson also annexed the South Island without knowing if Ngāi Tahu chiefs had signed the treaty. He said this was justified because of the, and again I quote, uncivilised state of the natives. So yeah, that alone makes the treaty problematic as a founding document, but it had an even bigger, huger, more enormous problem.
The Māori version of Te Tiriti or Waitangi did not say the same thing as the English version. The Māori version promised the chiefs tino rangatiratanga, usually translated as chiefly authority or self-government. The English version said something different. It said the chiefs ceded sovereignty to the crown, translated as kāwanatanga.
The thing is, kāwanatanga was a made-up word from the English word governorship, so it's hard to know what either party intended by committing to both Māori rangatiratanga and British kāwanatanga.
Here's how one rangatira, Nōpera Panakareao, summarised his understanding of Te Tiriti. Ko te atarau o te whenua I riro I a te kuini, ko te tinana o te whenua I waiho ki ngā Māori. The shadow of the land will go to the Queen, but the substance of the land will remain with us. Māori believed they would stay in charge of their own land. They thought the governor's authority would be limited to Pakeha land and people.
But a year after signing the treaty, Nōpera Panakareao spoke to a missionary outlining his frustration that the governor was acting as if he had complete authority over Aotearoa. Now Panakareao fears the substance of it will go to the crown, and the shadow would be the Māori portion. The problem was in Henry Williams' translation. The English version of the treaty did not say that Māori were entering into a power-sharing deal with rangatira. It said the Crown was going to take complete control of Aotearoa.
Why did this mistranslation happen? That's a tricky question.
On one hand, it might have been an honest mistake. Williams and his son did speak Te Reo Māori, but they weren't expert translators. Plus, this translation was done in a huge rush in the middle of the night, so maybe it's understandable they got some stuff wrong.
On the other hand, it might have been deliberate. Williams may have believed the treaty was the best way to protect Māori from Pakeha colonists, but also Williams had a vested interest in getting the treaty signed. He'd bought a lot of land from Māori and he needed those purchases officially recognised by the British government.
According to modern international law, indigenous translations of treaties take precedence. But back in the 1800s, the contradictory versions of Te Tiriti set up some very big fights between the British and Māori.
These conflicts have had a lot of names over the years. Originally they were called the Māori Wars, then the Land Wars. These days it's the New Zealand Wars.
The first conflict was started by our old mates at the New Zealand Company. By 1843, the New Zealand Company had established settlements in Nelson, Wellington and Whanganui, but they needed more farmland to make those settlements self-sustaining. Luckily, the company had bought extra land in the fertile Waitangi Valley, or at least they thought they had.
They got the deed to this land from the widow of a sailing captain, John Blenkinsop, who had supposedly bought it from Ngāti Toa in exchange for an obsolete cannon. Ngāti Toa's intention was merely to give them rights to water and timber, but Blenkinsop wrote a deed awarding himself the whole valley.
Dodgy land deals like this were a big part of why Māori signed the Treaty of Waitangi. William Hobson had promised to investigate land sales and return any land which was held unjustly.
But when the Ngāti Toa chiefs Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Haiata asked the British to investigate, nothing was done. So Ngāti Toa burned down the huts of some New Zealand Company surveyors. The company tried to have those two rangatira arrested. Te Rangi Haiata and Te Rauparaha tried to resolve things peacefully, but a gunfight broke out and several people were killed, including one of Te Rangi Haiata's wives, Te Rongo Pāmamao. Te Rangi Haiata demanded utu for the killing of his wife, so all the New Zealand Company's men were executed. One of the Pakeha killed was Edward Wakefield's brother, Arthur.
Yeah, these are actually his epaulets here. Luckily, this didn't kick off a full-on war. The new British governor investigated, determined the New Zealand Company had acted completely illegally, and urged both sides to stay peaceful.
But just a few years later, in 1845, we see the first major war between Pakeha and Māori, the Northern War.
In the 5 years following the signing of Te Tiriti, the British governors Hobson and Fitzroy started to impose their ideas of sovereignty. Hobson bought land from Ngāti Whātua at Tamaki and founded the city of Auckland, which he made the new capital of New Zealand.
Then Fitzroy brought in new taxes and regulations to help fund his new government. This was all bad news for Ngāpuhi. The taxes and regulations cost them money, and shifting the capital away from Russell significantly disrupted their ability to trade.
One of the people most frustrated was Hone Heke, the first rangatira to sign that treaty.
To Ngāpuhi leaders like Heke, the British were going well beyond the authority they'd been granted in the Māori version of Te Tiriti.
Heke and his powerful ally Tiriti Kawati decided to push back. First, Heke did this sort of ceremonially by cutting down the flagstaff at the north end of Kororareka.
He didn't just do this once though, he did it 3 times.
Then he and Kawati launched a raid on the town, which was probably mostly a distraction so that Heke could cut down the flagstaff one more time. But things got out of hand, 11 people died, and it sparked the Northern War.
Heke's strategy, however, divided Ngāpuhi, and lots of Northern Māori fought on the British side under the leadership of Tāmati Wākanene. You see, Māori ally themselves with the British all through the New Zealand Wars, and they do this for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's personal. For example, Tāmati Wākanene thought Hone Heke was a cheeky young upstart who should show more respect to his elders, and in other cases, it's opportunistic. Some rangatira allied with the British to settle old scores with rivals. But there were also genuine disagreements about whether fighting the British was a good idea. Many rangatira felt this was a war they couldn't hope to win in the long run.
So, in the Northern War, it's Hone Heke, Te Rūki Kawati and their allies versus the British, Tāmati Wākanene and his allies. The British were expecting this to be a quick and easy campaign. They had more men, more guns, lots of artillery.
But all that artillery turned out to be not as big a deal as hoped. That's because Māori had invented trench warfare.
Māori had already got pretty good at building fortifications to defend against gunfire during the musket wars. They built flax screens, wooden walls and ditches to block musket balls, slow down enemy charges and give their warriors better positions to shoot from.
And in the Northern War, Hone Heke and Kawati doubled down. At Ōhaiawai and Ruapekapeka, they dug anti-artillery bunkers, deep pits in the ground covered with thick logs and earth. These kind of defences were used throughout the New Zealand Wars. Often you see the British charging these pa, assuming the defenders had been blown to bits, only to be gunned down by the defenders.
Māori also used ambushes and guerrilla warfare to outmaneuver the British forces.
Thanks to tactics like these, the Northern War ended in a stalemate with a peace deal, and most British troops withdrew from Northland.
The British didn't have the military, economic or political power to impose their will on Māori, at least not yet. Europeans were restricted to a few small settlements.
But thanks to the New Zealand Company, Aotearoa's Pakeha population grew higher and higher. By 1858, Europeans would outnumber Māori in Aotearoa, and that would kick off the next phase of the New Zealand Wars. Thanks for joining us on the Aotearoa History Show, produced by RNZ and made possible by the RNZ New Zealand On Air Digital Innovation Fund.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. Please hit like and subscribe and ring that little bell so you get notified about all of our videos in the future.
And make sure to catch us on our next episode. Ka kite!
Ka kite.